This is a story about my dad. When my dad was 51 years old, he worked for a company as an engineer and as a salesman. He worked for the man. But this would change. You see, one day my dad came home late from the office, and he walked into the kitchen, and my mom was waiting for him. And she said, "Honey, I've got some news for you. I'm expecting." This wasn't just any expecting. This was to be their 8th child, me. My dad would tell me at that moment in time, I knew that I had 10 more years before I would have to retire from my company. But I would have 21 more years of college tuition to pay. I had a wife, a family, and a mortgage. He also told me that he knew he was 13 years older than my mom, and he never wanted anything to ever happen to him that would leave her destitute with all those children and no income. Can you imagine 10 more years to work and 8 children? Within 10 years, my dad would own 25 rent houses, and his life would be transformed by the power of recurring revenue. Now, we're all familiar with recurring revenue. That's my dad. We're all familiar with recurring revenue. Amazon has recurring revenue with Prime memberships. Microsoft has recurring revenue with their annual licensing fees. It's what helps these companies sleep very well at night. Well, I'm not so sure how well my dad was sleeping when he found out that he was going to be a father again. I was on the way, and he was in a bind. So where would he turn? Well, he reached deep into the recesses of his memory banks from when he was growing up in rural Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression in the 1930s. And he remembered when almost everyone in his family had gone broke. There was one who had not. And that was his uncle, Julian. You see, Julian owned rent houses and apartments. And Julian flourished during the Great Depression. So that's what my dad set out to do. He would harvest the power of recurring revenue by buying real estate. So how was he going to do this with 8 kids and a full-time job? Well, nowadays, I think everyone here has heard the terms as entrepreneurs, the side hustle. Maybe my dad was the inventor of the side hustle, I don't know. He said, "Chris, I can put 3 hours a day after work looking for properties, managing properties, showing properties." So that's what he did. He was able to cobble together what he said on weekends and after work, 25 hours a week. He said that was enough. So time was there. He also needed money. Imagine 8 kids. He lived a very modest life. Our house was very small. You're looking at someone who grew up in the sewing room. Does anyone here even know what a sewing room is? It was a glorified closet, for crying out loud, in my house. My mom made my clothes. I had several brothers who lived in the garage. Dad drove Oldsmobiles. Dad was the handyman for his own properties. On Saturdays, I would skip the cartoons and get in the car with my dad because I found what he was doing to be much more fascinating than what was on television. And I'd go with him as he climbed up into attics and fixed pipes. And he repaired leaky faucets. And he hung screen doors that had fallen off. He had an investment philosophy that if he saved that money, he could actually put more to use and buying more rent houses. So this is what his strategy was. People ask me, what was his strategy? He wasn't in the real estate business, so how did he know what to do? Well, he bought in neighborhoods, number one, that people weren't interested in, that were overlooked by the market. In Houston, it was a neighborhood called Rice Military. It was just outside of downtown, but it was pretty run down in the late 60s. He started buying houses, and he specialized in block after block after block. And he was able to amass several rent houses in that area. He also bought houses with good bones, but they were run down. So when he repaired them, he got a higher yield on his investment. And that was important because he wanted the cash flow. And this is probably one of the coolest things. He wasn't a flipper. He held the real estate because he wanted to serve my mother and our family with security, so we would never sell the assets. And it turned out to be very powerful. How powerful? Well, about 20 years into it, I watched as Texas turned economically to a really bad place. There was an oil crunch, and I was in college. And I watched so many people go bankrupt, friends of mine, parents. And I remember wondering, how's my dad gonna do? And my dad was actually flourishing, just like his Uncle Julian did during the Great Depression. Those rent houses stayed full. Instead of losing properties in foreclosure, my dad was actually buying properties for pennies on the dollar from banks. It was extremely powerful for me to see that. The impact that made on my family was incredible. My dad was right. He would leave the world before my mom. Now 21 years. My mom is in her 90s. She lives in the same home that she lived in 1955. She has 24-hour round-the-clock care because my dad set out to have recurring revenue for our family. My dad also, when he retired when he was 60 years old, realized he had some more gas in the engine. So he wanted to start another company, and he did. And that company today is one of the largest of its kind in the world in manufacturing natural gas pipeline parts. He also brought in refugees from Cambodia and Vietnam in the late 70s and early 80s, and he had some places to put them. He actually put them in his rent houses and helped get them jobs. And then finally, he started a foundation that helped single mothers who were in crisis pregnancy. And that foundation is still alive today. And none of that, he told me, would have ever been possible if he would have done nothing and just waited on that pension check. That was the power of recurring revenue for my father. So my dad found out that he was going to be a father again at 51 years old. And he decided he was going to be inspired.